Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
The EU's chief negotiator, Michel Barnier, says a deal on Brexit can be reached by November if talks are realistic. It comes as a former Brexit minister warned the Prime Minister that the Conservative Party faces a catastrophic split if she persists with her current Brexit strategy. Steve Baker says up to 80 MPs would vote against her so-called Chequers proposal, in which the UK would maintain a common rule book for all goods with the European Union. Our political editor Laura Kunsberg has the latest.
Arriving at the office back door. Work in the red box. Tory woes splashed over the paper. The Prime Minister's clutching too. In 200 days, she's to be the leader that takes us out of the EU. But the actual deal must be done long before. Today, Europe's negotiator sounded more friend than foe.
I think that if we are realistic, we are able to reach an agreement on the first stage of this negotiation, which is the Brexit treaty, within 6 or 8 weeks.
The rivalries at home are bitter, though. Boris Johnson holed up at his country house. No word on his private life, but objections aplenty to the government's plan for Brexit. Many Tories at Westminster hate the so-called Chequers plan, where parts of the economy would stay closely tied to the EU, but with no hard border in Ireland. And one former Brexit minister says dozens of his colleagues would vote against it, and it could even break the party.
The Chequers answer is threatening to split the Tory party in two, with even proponents of remaining in the EU opposing Chequers.
Your plan is where? Where's your alternative?
We will bring forward our ideas, but what we're not going to do is preempt them today. The fundamental issue here is that we've ended up in a trap, in a sense, of our own design, which we need to help the government out of.
But there's no sign of the government budging. Ministers hope enough MPs will choose a deal rather than none at all.
Can the Chequers deal survive?
Of course it will.
Could the Conservative Party split over Chequers, do you think?
No, I don't think we will. I think we'll reach a good agreement and all have the right Brexit that will work for the country.
Hello. Yes, I'm sorry, I've got a bit of a sore
Do you think the Chequers still can survive, Mr. Gove?
This is more than Tories squabbling about Europe, way past the point of who backed Leave or Remain, who hates or really supports Brexit. But this is whether Theresa May can find a compromise with the rest of the EU that ultimately she can get through Parliament. The belief in government is most MPs would support her, rather than choose unknown chaos and no deal. But the truth, with no majority of her own, there can be no guarantee. Laura Kunsberg, BBC News, Westminster.
Well, let's go to Brussels now and our Europe editor Katya Adler. And what do you make of Michel Barnier's comments then?
Well, Sophie, should Theresa May be happy this evening? Well, probably yes. She, like the rest of us, has got used to Michel Barnier wagging his finger when he talks about Brexit, tapping his foot, pointing at his watch and saying time's running out. Today, he said it's possible that in 6 to 8 weeks' time, there will be a Brexit deal. He also spoke about her beleaguered Chequers plan and described it as a useful document, and he even had warm words for the Prime Minister herself. But, Sophie, if you really look closely at Mr. Barnier's words today, it was a more of change in tone rather than content. He still talked about those big hurdles that have to be overcome in order to get a Brexit deal, like the Irish border question. He said that EU leaders still had key opposition to big parts of the Chequers deal. So you could say, why did he bother with that change of tone today? Well, that is because time really is running out now, and EU leaders want a Brexit deal this autumn. They see Theresa May's political difficulties at home, and they've decided to throw her as much of a lifeline as they can without compromising their Brexit policy. So expect Michel Barnier's honeyed words today to spread over into the EU leaders meeting in Salzburg next week. But we're talking here about a change in atmospherics rather than a real sea change in the EU's Brexit negotiating position.
Katya Adler, thank you.
Now, it's not often we report on what seems a good Brexit day for the Prime Minister, but we may be eating a slice of humble pie this morning. After a weekend of criticism and dissent within her own ranks, Theresa May got some encouragement from the EU, with its chief negotiator saying Brussels is not far from reaching an agreement with the UK, and a deal could be done in November. Our political editor Faisal Islam reports.
Finally, some respite for the Prime Minister. Talk of the death of her Chequers plan at the hands of Michel Barnier not quite right, as the EU chief negotiator went out of his way to keep the PM's plan alive, just about ahead of next week's EU summit in Salzburg.
I think that if we are realistic, we are able to reach an agreement on the first stage of this negotiation, which is the Brexit treaty, within 6 or 8 weeks. Chequers, the white paper, is useful, because it's clearly defined what are the wishes of the UK for the future relations. And on many of the sectors, the proposal, we can agree, because they join clearly what we have proposed on our side.
The EU olive branch is mainly about security cooperation, not trade or customs, though even that's helpful on a day when the PM came under sharp internal fire from one of her former Brexit team, ex-Minister Steve Baker.
About the only thing the Conservative Party has come together on around Chequers is that it is unacceptable, unviable and won't go through. I'm not here today to either threaten the Prime Minister or to make any suggestion about who should replace her. What we want to do is change the policy, not the person. It's not for us to dictate the policy. It's not for us to start pushing for any leadership change.
In the Commons, the Brexit debates began again with Mr Baker's former ministerial colleague, who remained after Brexit, left to defend Chequers.
Can she explain how on earth that deal is going to proceed when 80, supposedly, of her own colleagues, including members of her own ERG group, her former ministerial colleague, the member for Wickham and others, have said that they're going to vote against it? Isn't the reality that the Prime Minister's Chequers deal is dead?
I'm optimistic that we are going to strike a mutually beneficial free trade agreement with the EU, which honours the result of the referendum, which retains the territorial integrity of our country, and which enables a smooth withdrawal from the EU.
The Labour front bench also listing reasons why they would not back Chequers too.
The intervention of the former Brexit minister was not required to confirm what we know, that currently there is no majority for the Prime Minister's Chequers plan in that House of Commons. But some Brexiters freely admit that there's no majority for anything else either, whether it's their favoured Canada option or the no-deal option too. And what's true is that this was the Brexiters' chance to put forward their alternative plan, and it hasn't yet been forthcoming. As some Theresa May allies put it, their approach is that no plan is better than a bad plan.
Waiting in the wings, Boris Johnson, with his Commons seat now in the balance should the boundary review pass. He was advocating domestic tax cuts to boost the economy, presumably after he forces the PM to chuck Chequers. But that plan is not quite dead yet. Faisal Islam, Sky News.
80 Conservative MPs will vote against the Chequers plan, according to the former Brexit Minister Steve Baker. His European research group of Conservative MPs says it will set out some alternative plans for Brexit, although not a full manifesto that some had talked about. There are also Tory MPs on the other side of the Brexit argument who are threatening to leave the party if Boris Johnson were ever to become leader. With just 200 days to go until the UK exits the EU, the febrile atmosphere in and out of Westminster shows no sign of easing. Here's our political editor, Gary Gibbon.
For years he's generated media scrums. This weekend he's been generating headlines while trying to stay away from the cameras, throwing a grenade into the debate on Brexit, as one aide put it, with grabby language that looked designed to throw attention away from his private life. He was cornered by cameras at his Oxfordshire home today. As Boris Johnson wrestled for a parking space, another minister who resigned over Theresa May's plans for Brexit warned that an 80-strong group of pro-Brexit Tory MPs was ready to vote down the deal if Mrs May presses ahead.
I'm gravely concerned that our party is heading towards a really catastrophic split if this plan is taken forwards, and particularly if it's taken forwards and driven through with Labour votes.
Steve Baker's been involved in enough rebellions over the years to know that you never know what the numbers are, literally often to the last hour, let alone the last day, and that's when you know what the proposal is.
How are you?
However many Tory rebels there were, the Chief Whip, Julian Smith, would have to win over nearly the same number of Labour MPs to plug the gap.
I think we're going to have another positive week and a positive conference, and we're going to deliver Brexit.
Pro-Brexit Tory MPs think the Chief Whip hopes fear of no deal and chaos and closeness to the March deadline for Brexit will grind down Tory opponents.
If the government were to seek to terrify people into voting for anything rather than no deal, I do think that that would be profoundly against the national interest.
So that's where you think they're heading?
Well, I fear that the government may seek to terrify people. It ought not.
Actually, Steve, come on, be a statesman here. Don't be a cheap, backbench troublemaker. Be a statesman here. Put the nation's interests absolutely first and foremost, and that does not involve putting Brexit at risk.
Boris Johnson was caught by the cameras watching the Test match at the weekend. His face on the big screen prompted some boos from the crowd.
The former Foreign Secretary appears to be on his own.
There's also a bit of a diplomatic boo from the EU's chief negotiator today.
Let me say that I have a great respect for Mrs. May. Great respect. And generally speaking, I have a great respect for the British people, for this country.
Including Boris Johnson.
For this country.
Michel Barnier said it was realistic to imagine a deal being agreed within 6 to 8 weeks. That sent the pound up. But Theresa May's pro-Brexit Tory critics say she has 6 to 8 weeks to change policy.
People might make a move on her if she hasn't changed tack by November.
I wouldn't like to forecast that. What I am saying is that political chaos lies ahead if we don't get
what you're saying.
I'm not threatening it. What I'm saying is I am deeply concerned from my canvassing of colleagues that what lies ahead is chaos if there isn't a change of policy.
If Theresa May pursues Chequers, the Tory party could split in two. Well, listening to you, listening to him, sounds like that's work in progress.
Is it only two?
The government today published the Boundary Commission review of general election constituencies. It's meant to bring down the number of seats by 50, but also even up the size of different constituencies. Experts say if these had been the constituencies fought in the last general election, Theresa May could be governing with a majority of 16. As it is, she's trying to govern without a majority and can't be sure she'll get these changes through or her Brexit plans. Gary Gibbon, Channel 4 News, Westminster.
Well, more from him later in the programme. Earlier, I spoke to the Conservative MP, Ross Thompson. He's a backer of Brexit. I asked him why we haven't seen any sign of a document supposedly to be released today that would outline some alternative plan.
Well, what you'll be seeing over the next few weeks is actually the ERG coming forward with proposals to actually give solutions to some of the problems that have been identified with Chequers. It's not an alternative plan. I don't think it should be one plan pitched against the other. That would be very unhelpful. Also, we're not the government, of course. We don't have the resources of a civil service. We are just a group of parliamentarians within Parliament. But you will see over the next few weeks real solutions, we believe, and helpful and constructive solutions to areas such as how we could mitigate some of the concerns around about the Northern Ireland border, in order to have that kind of free, fair trade agreement that we would like to see. So some helpful solutions will be coming their way, just not the sort of comprehensive, detailed document that some people have talked about.
But therefore, the only plan we do have is the Chequers plan. What's wrong with that?
Well, in terms of the Chequers plan, John, I've been really clear that I don't think it meets what people voted for in 2016. I also would like to point out that...
Specifically how? Specifically?
Okay. Well, I'd like to point out, first of all, I did give the plan a chance. I wanted to get more detail and see the white paper before I made a decision on whether or not I thought it was the right thing to proceed with. I've come to the conclusion it's not, and the reasons for that, first and foremost, is I don't think it actually allows us to take back control of our own rule-making. You'll have heard of the Common Rule Book. That means we'll be tied into EU standards on goods and therefore the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice. So in that sense, we are not leaving those institutions of the EU still bound into the rules that they have made and will continue to make in those areas.
But the fact remains that that is the only proposal that exists for ordinary voters to look at. And it seems that you were going to produce a document that people could look at, but now you're going to do it over a number of weeks and this and that. Why can't you be pithy and be as absolute as Mrs May has been?
Okay, I'd say it's not the only proposal. As you'll know yourself, and it has been something mooted by the European Union, is actually having that sort of super Canada-style free trade agreement. That's something I think would unite everybody.
Let's be clear, Mrs May is wedded to this plan, to the Chequers plan. If you get rid of the plan, you presumably have to get rid of her.
No, I've been really clear that Theresa May is our Prime Minister, our leader, and I still feel is the best person who's best placed to deliver on Brexit. I'm not interested in talking about personnel or changes in people. I just want to see the policy change.
But it's very clear that she is never going to embrace the Rees-Mogg spectacle of Brexit.
Well, I think the Prime Minister is someone who listens to her colleagues, and she's been doing that throughout the summer. I think she's also been listening to the public and Conservative Party members. I think they've been very, very clear that something does need to change. And the Prime Minister showed in the past that she can change her mind. Governments of all colours can show
the fact
they can
is,
change their
she
mind.
hasn't changed her mind and shows no sign of changing her mind. And there are at least 80 MPs, like you, Tory MPs, who are wedded to ensuring that Chequers doesn't happen.
Well, to be fair to the Prime Minister, she's been going round European capitals. I think she's been getting a message back from the EU itself that Chequers, as it is not going to work. I think she's been listening to colleagues over the summer who are telling her that Chequers is not going to work. I think that, yes, the Prime Minister can be, as it's called, the bloody difficult woman, but in fairness to her, I think she wants this to succeed and get through Parliament, and I think there will be changes to Chequers.
And is your Conservative Party leader in Scotland with you?
Ruth Davidson, I'm in close contact with. She is my leader in Scotland. We have taken different views on Brexit, but my loyalties are absolutely to her. And, you know, down here I've got a job to do as MP in terms of scrutinising the government as well as supporting it. And that's why we'd like to see changes to the Chequers plan.
Well, you sound to me as if you have a tangled political life. Two women leaders who you disagree with, but are totally loyal to. And,
yeah, they're very strong women. We're very blessed in the Conservative Party to have such strong women.
Thank you very much indeed, Ross Thompson.
Thank you.
Well, now we're joined by the MP Sarah Wollaston, who backed Remain during the referendum campaign. Sarah Wollaston, this is becoming really quite worrying. 200 days to go. One plan, which is rejected by 80 Conservative MPs, and no alternative.
Yes, it's absolutely disgraceful. The hard Brexiteers haven't even come up with a credible, coherent plan of their own, despite having all this time to do so. And what we're now seeing is that them forcing us closer and closer to the edge of a cliff. Because the government has their plan, they are threatening to completely scupper it and will vote with Labour to do so. And meanwhile, the clock ticks down. 200 days now until we leave, and we could end up leaving with a chaotic no deal and no transition, which would be the worst possible arrangement of all.
But we must presume that Mrs May is actually working on something associated with Chequers, but that is in some way more palatable to the more difficult people in your party.
Well, the trouble with that, of course, is it is likely to be rejected by the European Union. So I come back to my former point, that we have all these different groups speaking entirely different languages as the clock ticks down to the date that we're actually due to leave. And we could end up by accident almost. We seem to be sleepwalking to the edge of a cliff here. And I think that what we're seeing as well is as the government publishes their series of technical notes about planning for no deal, what the public are now seeing is the sort of disastrous financial consequences that will hold for us. So far from having any kind of Brexit bonus, we're going to see a very significant Brexit penalty and real consequences for individuals, families, communities and businesses that will become more apparent as I say, the clock ticks down to this situation. I think it's totally unacceptable.
Technically, there is a majority of, well, shall we call them soft Brexit or even possible Remainers in the House of Commons. Do you talk to Labour Remainers, or at least to Labour soft Brexiteers, and perhaps see some way of forging a way forward?
Well, of course, and I think it would have been better if right from the outset we'd taken a cross-party approach to these negotiations, because the truth is that there are divisions within both main parties about the best way forward here. And I think that the discussions I have now across political parties is what happens if we are in a situation where we could crash out with a chaotic no deal. My view is, rather as we would expect anyone undergoing surgery to be able to give their informed consent consent, to know exactly what the operation involves, to be able to weigh up the risks and the benefits. And I think we would need to check informed consent from people before we embarked on something with such far-reaching consequences for them as a chaotic no deal with no transition.
You've just heard quite a typical current view from the Brexiteers, which is, I love Mrs May, but I hate Chequers. That surely doesn't stack up, does it? Isn't the truth that they're really muscling to get rid of her and possibly get Boris Johnson in?
Well, and of course we've seen the very intemperate, inappropriate language used by Boris Johnson over the weekend, comparing our Prime Minister with a suicide bomber. I mean, how terrible was that? And these are the people who claim that they're loyalists, whilst at the same time using this kind of language and clearly trying to force her hand or threatening to remove her. It's wholly unacceptable. They need to be being prepared to sort of compromise and actually have a deal that actually can get through the House of Commons.
You're a doctor. You came into the House of Commons presumably as something of an innocent in a way. What has confronted you surely must have absolutely poleaxed your desire to be an MP.
Well, I think what has appalled me is the lack of an evidence-based approach to this. And as I say, I would use the medical analogy of informed consent, that you wouldn't expect as a patient to consent to surgery 2 years in advance without knowing whether someone was going to remove a few toes or your whole leg. And you certainly would expect at any point during that process, once you knew exactly what was involved, to have someone set out the risks and benefits and to be able to give your informed consent. And we certainly do not have informed consent to the hardest of Brexits with no transition because of the sheer scale of the costs and the consequences to real people's lives. And I think that if we do find ourselves falling off the cliff in that way, inevitably, in a few years' time, people will be asking how on earth it could have happened. And I think those MPs who haven't been very clear and straightforward with people about the consequences will be held culpable.
Dr. Sarah Williston, thank you very much for talking to us.
Now, Brexit has loomed large over the TUC's annual gathering in Manchester. We'll be joining our political correspondent Michael Crick there shortly. But first, to the Labour Parliamentary Party, which is meeting in Westminster tonight, meeting in the aftermath of a weekend of political angst and the controversial plea from Chuka Umunna to call off the dogs over no confidence votes for some Labour constituency MPs. Our political editor, Gary Gibbon, is at the House of Commons. Gary, what's going on?
Well, that meeting's still going on of Labour MPs and Jeremy Corbyn. He's turned up for this one. The MPs meet every week. Normally, there's a kind of crackle of tension when the leader is coming in because the questions come hard and fast and there's quite a lot of friction in the room. A couple of people who've already left early are suggesting to me that actually it's slightly subdued today. Nonetheless, the MPs are, on the whole, asking hostile questions, and a lot of them are about the ongoing dispute over anti-Semitism. At one point, one MP asked a question, he said, on behalf of the Jewish Labour MP, Luciana Berger, who couldn't be at the meeting because of the Jewish bank holiday, Rosh Hashanah, and that question was, why on earth were you, Jeremy Corbyn, trying to amend yet again and read into the NEC a different statement on anti-Semitism that diverted from the internationally agreed definition. I'm getting the impression from contacts in the room that MPs are not happy with the answers that they're getting, but the other thing they're talking about, interesting you were talking about Brexit there, that's not featuring as far as I can work out in the room. The other thing they're talking about is deselections. And what happened there was one quite flurry of a moment when Wes Streeting, the backbench Labour MP, asked the Labour leader why on earth he'd been pre-briefing through his aides a remark that he was going to say, saying, I understand what it feels like to be the target of no confidence votes, pretty snippy language there, but it would be wrong of me to intervene in the democratic activities of the constituency associations, i.e. you're on your own, mates, if they're turning on you. He didn't read out those words in the room, even though they've been pre-briefed. Labour MPs are tackling him about that, and somewhere along the line, presumably some clarity will emerge on whether he stands by those words or not.
Gary Gibbon in the House of Commons there. Well, at the Trades Union Congress in Manchester, delegates have voted to keep open the option of a public vote on any final Brexit deal. Not a second referendum, say union leaders, but a say on any deal affecting pay and employment rights. Our political correspondent Michael Crick reports.
It began here. 150 years ago, the Trades Union Congress was founded at the Mechanics Institute in the heart of Manchester.
The meeting in 1868 passed a motion promising to take action in all parliamentary matters relating to the interests of the working classes. 150 years later, 5 or 10 minutes walk from here, they're still at it, but arguing about what is in the interests of the working class when it comes to Brexit.
Today, the TUC added to the pressure on Theresa May, ostensibly, but really on Jeremy Corbyn for a yes or no vote on the final Brexit deal.
I'm serving notice on the Prime Minister. If you come back with a deal that doesn't put workers first, and if you won't call a general election, then I'm warning you, we'll throw our full weight behind a campaign and demand that the terms of the deal are put to a popular vote.
But the unions aren't united. Many of their members voted leave 2 years ago, as did this union leader, who fears a popular vote could stop Brexit altogether.
But let's be honest here. The people's vote, or a popular vote, is nothing more than a Trojan horse to a second EU referendum. A second referendum that would lead to social unrest. And that's not just me saying that, the Labour front bench is saying it. Congress, if I went back to my members who have felt that had already been rejected, I would get unrest as well.
But this leader argued that taking deals back to the members was all part of the trade union tradition.
We are all trade unionists. Whenever we negotiate a deal, we go back to our members and we ask them whether or not that deal is good enough. If it's good enough and they vote yes, then it's all well and good. But if they don't, we go back and try and get something that's better. And that's exactly what we're saying with this.
The new policy sailed through with the backing of the biggest union, Newsnight, who insist it's a means to a so-called jobs-first Brexit and a Corbyn government, not a backdoor to remaining inside the EU.
No, the reality is that the people have voted. We are leaving the European Union. As Democrats, we have to accept that. The problem is we should be leaving the European Union with agreements that protect jobs, investments, and deal with people's concerns as to why they voted leave. Now, the only party that can do that is Labour.
And bit by bit, the Labour movement seems to be edging towards giving people another say.
Well, the debate here today was something of a dress rehearsal to a similar debate that's likely to take place at the Labour conference in Liverpool in a couple of weeks' time, involving some of the same characters and quite likely the same decision. But it's the interpretation of these decisions that's interesting. The People's Vote campaign, who've been campaigning for months now, clearly see a People's Vote as a means of staying in the European Union. But people here, many of them made clear today, they don't see it like that. They don't want to thwart the decision made to vote Brexit by many of their members 2 years ago. And indeed, some union leaders also made it clear they don't want to associate with those people on the centre and the right of the Labour Party who've been linked with that campaign and also been huge critics of Jeremy Corbyn. And indeed, the Unite leader, Len McCluskey, today told Corbyn's critics to shut up or leave and go elsewhere.
Michael Crick at the TUC Congress up there in Manchester. Back to Brexit now, and the summer holidays already seem long gone. The rows over Brexit have roared back to life and are again at centre stage in the national debate. With a lot going on today, we've condensed all you really need to know into our regular Brexit Minute. In a galaxy far, far away, all sides in the Brexit debate think the other is living in a science fiction fantasy. But as we catapult out of hyperspeed, we hear that Brexiteers' alternative plan to Chequers contains demands for a Star Wars-style missile defence system. Mr. Jacob Rees-Mogg, who won't confirm if he is Jedi or Sith in this debate, has held back from publishing the plan. Instead, we get a speech tomorrow on international trade and a new social media video.
I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, and I'm standing up for Brexit. On the 29th of March next year, we want to leave the European Union and take back control of our own affairs. Chequers is not Brexit.
Over the din of those game birds on Jacob's estate, you might hear number 10 crow. There is no plan for Chequers. As for Boris Suicide Vest Johnson, Downing Street are refusing to dignify his comments with a response. With the EU preparing for its Brexit summit in Salzburg in 2 weeks' time, one lot of European sources are denying another lot of European sources who claim a Save Theresa May operation is underway, and that Michel Barnier will be given new instructions to help her. Or not. There are 200 days left until Brexit.
200 days until the UK leaves the EU. Is the mood music from Europe shifting? Chief Brexit negotiator Michel Barnier has said a Brexit deal is possible within 6 to 8 weeks, with an arrangement in place by November at the latest. So how to read the tea leaves? Is he suggesting Europe can make something work from the Chequers proposal, or just confirming, as Newsnight reported last week, the original October talks would have to slip to accommodate anything at all? And where does this leave all those Conservatives, reportedly up to 80, who oppose the Prime Minister's Chequers plan? Well, one of those, the former Conservative leader, Ian Duncan-Smith, has tonight told Newsnight that Downing Street should stop attacking Brexit supporters. Who's winning the game right now? Here's Nick Watt.
Both leaders of the Conservative Party, both advocates of the Brexit cause, and the original believer was once full of praise for the convert.
Mr. Speaker, can I congratulate my right honourable friend on what I thought was an excellent speech, clear and determined, and giving the European Union a very clear sense of direction.
But the Chequers blueprint led to a falling out between Theresa May and Ian Duncan-Smith, and now he believes Downing Street is briefing against his side.
I always think that rather than allowing a unit in Downing Street or whatever to take on its own colleagues and backbenchers and accuse and attack them, I think the best thing is always for them to say, I tell you what, let's get together and thrash this out and see what we can come up with. That's a far better approach because it carries the party with you.
The sharp intervention by Ian Duncan-Smith highlights the febrile atmosphere as Brexiteers seek to bury Chequers. His side, some of whom are having dinner here tonight, were riled when Downing Street loyalists spoke of chaos and division amongst Brexiteers. That happened after the European Research Group decided to scale back its launch of its alternative plan. One Eurosceptic told me, "Why do anything when your enemy is making mistakes?"
The ERG is not the government. We do not have the full resources of a civil servant that are at the disposal of ministers and others. So we can't provide, some kind of huge comprehensive document about all the alternatives to pit against the government. But in areas where we think there are sticking points and where we can be helpful, those suggestions will be put forward prior to conference.
The Northern Ireland border will be addressed by the Brexiteers this week. Ian Duncan-Smith believes this is the only issue standing in the way of a relatively straightforward trade deal with the EU.
The Northern Ireland backstop is the cause of why the government's gone shunting off down the Chequers road, because they don't think that they can get a free trade deal because they'd have to do it without Northern Ireland. I believe that's not so, and I believe there are plenty of solutions for that, and those will be presented later on. But the key point is the Commission has to be able to prepare to come to that party and say, yes, we are prepared to show some flexibility on this so that there can be a UK-wide free trade deal. If they do that, I think you could make dramatic progress. It would require, of course, the British government to decide that actually, from Chequers, they can go back to the free trade arrangement.
Downing Street believes Chequers is still alive after the EU's chief negotiator struck an upbeat note during an interview today.
I think that if we are realistic, we are able to reach an agreement on the first stage of this negotiation, which is the Brexit treaty, within 6 or 8 weeks. We must reach an agreement before the beginning of November. I think it's possible.
Well, I think what's been really interesting is that the EU didn't come straight out and say no to Chequers. I think they do want there to be a deal. I think they want to support Theresa May and to recognise the political difficulties here for her in the Conservative Party in the UK. And I think that's a good sign that Barnier wants there to be a deal. That clearly the Salzburg meeting later on this month is going to be very important in terms of the support from other EU heads of government, and that's why I think it's right that we should give the Prime Minister and the government time to see where they can get to in negotiating Chequers or something along the lines of Chequers.
Tonight, Downing Street reached out to Brexiteers with a dinner for critics. Theresa May's aides pleaded for Chequers to be given some space.
Well, that was Nick Watt, and joining us now is the Conservative MP Crispin Blunt of the European Research Group. Nice of you to come in. Am I right in thinking you were one of those invited to the dinner for critics?
Well, if that's all you want to call it, I was had a dinner this evening, which was a Conservative Party event, talking to one of the Prime Minister's officials.
And that was to woo you, essentially, to get you on board with Chequers?
Well, I think it's a sensible part of number 10 management of the parliamentary party.
And did you come away more convinced? Did you feel that the right thing had been said to make Chequers more palatable?
Well, it was a useful occasion, but I'm not going to say more than that about the event, because it was a private event, and those discussions ought to remain private.
A lot of your colleagues, I think, turned down that invitation. Does that suggest that you are more minded to be open to Chequers? I mean, you know, leave the dinner to one side. Are you considering that you might be able to back Chequers?
Well, the first point that has to be crossed is the European Union agreeing the Chequers proposal by the United Kingdom.
Sounds like there's movement there, doesn't it?
Well, no, it doesn't. If one actually listened to what Mr Barnier said, he was talking about the Brexit deal. He was talking about the withdrawal agreement, which will be a treaty that needs to be concluded in 8 weeks. All he's said about the Chequers proposal, as I understand it, is that it is at least a basis for discussion. Well, bully, that's really generous of him, that it's actually a basis for discussion, the British proposal. When, of course, the Chequers construction is a British government reaction to the inflexibility of the European Union over the issue of the Northern Irish border, which is, in my judgment, completely unnecessary if you were having a negotiation between two parties determined to deliver in the best interests of the people they represent.
Where's the ERG's proposal?
Well, I'm not an officer of the ERG. You'll need to ask the chair and other officers of the ERG exactly what they do.
You're in the ERG, aren't you, Crispin? You're in the ERG.
Well, it's not a Masonic group. It doesn't apply a whip. It's a forum for like-minded colleagues who have significant concerns about it, to be able to have about the whole exit arrangement and what concessions might unwisely be made by the United Kingdom in not giving us the freedom to be able to exercise all the opportunities that come from leaving the European Union.
I'm not getting at you at all. I'm just saying that as a member of the ERG, you yourself must have been thinking, we're going to see the blueprint of this. We're going to see what the leaders of the ERG propose instead of Chequers. I'm sure you're as disappointed as the rest of us.
I don't think the position of the ERG is actually any different to that of the government. The government in the negotiations put forward a free trade agreement, kind of Canada plus to the European Union. The European Union have turned around and said no, because that is only available for Great Britain. It is not available for the United Kingdom, having created this issue over the Northern Ireland border. Well, so the government have gone. So the government have gone away and have come up with the Chequers proposals, which meet those in the view of the government, meet those requirements of the European Union. And Mr Barnier and the French and others have been distinctly cool over those proposals. Now, there are other...
But you know where we are tonight, because you heard Steve Baker say that he believes up to 80 Tory MPs could vote against Chequers. So the big question is, if Steve Baker and the rest of them at the ERG don't like the Chequers proposal, what is the proposal that the British public can see?
Well, that at the moment is a hypothetical question, because Chequers goes nowhere.
Well, it's a hypothetical proposal because they haven't shown it to anyone. That's the problem, isn't it?
The Chequers proposal has been shown to everyone. It's been shown to the European
and the ERG say they don't like that, but they haven't shown us any alternative.
Well, it's nothing to do. It's the ERG, in a sense, are irrelevant to the discussion that goes on between the British.
They're not irrelevant if they're stopping the Chequers deal from going through.
Well, no, they're not. When the ERG, however many there are of us who would then, if you like, vote what you see as an ERG line on Chequers, is not critical to this position. What is critical to this position, first off, is an agreement with our European Union partners and the British government to the Chequers proposal. And if that doesn't happen, then it doesn't matter what anybody thinks of Chequers, because there is then no agreement to put to the UK Parliament.
Absolutely right. And you're perhaps hearing something different to what has been reported today, which seems to be, or has been reported as, an easing of, a moving towards Theresa May by Michel Barnier. Now, are you categorically saying that's not happening and we've got that all wrong?
I haven't spent the day, I confess I spent probably more of the day watching Cook get his 100 than watching the latest anniversary from Michel Barnier.
You're forgiven for doing that, but you know, the FT is reporting quite strongly that there is movement from Michel Barnier to help
if you listen
Theresa May.
carefully to what Michel Barnier said, there was no movement. There was an expression of confidence that we can get an agreement on the withdrawal agreement where we're going to give them £39 billion. Terrific. Unsurprising that they're going to go for that agreement. He's been distinctly cool on Chequers. Simply saying it's a basis for discussion is hardly earth-shattering. And then you've had strong opposition to Chequers from people like the French Europe Minister and others, and the language used by...
So I come back to my original point.
So therefore, all of this discussion about what the position of the ERG is and everything else is actually entirely OGOs until there's actually an agreement between the UK and the European Union.
You've come in tonight, Crispin, presumably to help us understand where MPs like yourself in the ERG stand. Are you definitely against Chequers? Could you rule it out now, as many in the ERG will do and have done?
It's certainly my default position that I do not like what is in the Chequers agreement. I do not... The opportunities presented by Brexit are for us to be free of things like the rules that will then govern the manufacture of goods in the United Kingdom forever going forward, because they'll be set by the European Union.
And you would agree, then, it is pitiful that we, the British public, can't even see laid out in plain English what you would like to see as a proposal from the ERG.
The ERG is not the government. This is what, the idea that the ERG is some kind of alternative government in waiting.
So we're never going to see it?
So the government is going to have to put forward, as it has done, its best effort to try and meet the concerns of the European Union. We'll need to see whether that is good enough for the European Union. If it isn't, we are then back to what I think is then the previous position, which is a free trade deal, kind of Canada plus plus. And then it will be up to the European Union to decide whether or not that is going to fall on what, frankly, is the shibboleth of the issue of the Northern Ireland border.
You're most welcome back when we know more. Thank you for coming in.